Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen, and with us for our program today, Assemblyman Will Barclay. Will Barclay represents the 120th Assembly District, an Assembly District that includes the counties of Oswego, Onondaga, and Jefferson. And we want to thank you folks all throughout the region for joining us for our program today. Will Barclay, nice to see you.
Mike, good to be here.
Yeah,
how are you?
Very good, thank you. We all survived the budget.
We did.
You know, the final night of the budget was one of those nights here at the state capitol where the legislature was still churning and working until, I don't know, about 3:30 in the morning, I think it was.
Yeah, it didn't get done on time. I mean, we would have to get it done by midnight. We got it done about, you're right, about 3 o'clock in the morning. So in my book, technically that's maybe not on time, but for all practical purposes.
Good enough for government work is what we like to say here.
Everybody's asleep at that time anyway, so.
So, you know, we laugh at it now, but it makes for a long day. And, you know, I sometimes wonder about the efficiencies of that sort of thing. But nevertheless, the budget is in place. So we've got a lot to talk about on our program today. And we'll be getting to the budget discussion in just a minute. But you have a local event that you want to get up and out front and center, and that's a blood drive coming up.
That's right. May 1st, I have a blood drive in Oswego at the Elks Lodge in Oswego. It's an event I do every year. As you know, Mike, giving blood's really very important, particularly after the winter. I think actual blood donations go down during flu season and when it's cold outside. I guess not surprisingly, people don't get out as much. So they really are in desperate need in the springtime. So as a result of that, we're doing a blood drive in Oswego at the Elks Club, 9 o'clock, I think, to 2 o'clock on this Friday. I think it's May 1st.
Great. Well, there's all the details right there. But if you folks want to find out how to get more information, May 1st, 9 o'clock at the Elks Lodge, call the number you see on the screen there, 598-5185, and they'll give you all the details. Maybe you can find out about making appointments or what is the best way to go about it. But as Will Barclay said, blood is the gift of life, as that old saying goes, and it's never more true than now, and people should, it's a great way to help out the community.
It's true, and some people think it's just for traumatic injury, which it is obviously used a lot. I think a car accident I read the other day takes something like amazing, like I don't know how many injuries that means, but they say for a single car accident it could take up to 90 pints of blood, which seems incredible, doesn't it? But it's not just for traumatic type injuries like that, it's also for cancer patients. For instance, they'll need, anyone going into the hospital for any kind of operation usually needs a blood transfusion. So you've got to think of it, there's a huge need out there, and it's, you know, so anything people can do, and I would encourage you please to come and give on this Friday.
It's a constant need, and it's only a reminded need when there is some kind of trauma or catastrophic event. But the need is always there. So this is a great time, folks, you know, to find out. Call that number, get a hold of Will Barclay's office, and get the information you need to help out on May 1st. All right, now on to the other news of the day, and that's the budget passage at the state capitol. There was a lot of discussion. You go spend $140, $150 billion. There's a lot of ground to cover.
There was. I mean, I think the three biggest issues that we face in this year's budget: education, probably the biggest one, the one I heard the most about from teachers, obviously, and parents and students for that matter. They are very concerned about the governor's proposal to tie teacher evaluation to the increased school aid. They kind of punted the ball a little bit. The governor wanted to do 50% of the evaluations based on state testing. They said, well, that's too much. We're going to put it over to SED, the State Education Department, let them come up with some formulaic, I guess, solution to this, but it's a little unclear exactly what that is. I think it's unfortunate.
How about the funding? Did the
funding was good? So the funding did go through, and I think we had an increase of over $1 billion, maybe $1.3 billion in increased aid. So that's going to help school districts obviously out a lot. But the real pushback was really on this evaluations. As you know, the teachers union and others said we ought to have our students opt out as a way to kind of protest having our evaluations tied to the state testing. So and that's just happened last week, the state testing happened. My son took it. I have a sixth grader that we decided to have him take the test, but I know a lot of people for various reasons decide not to have their children opt out. And I think from around Oswego County, Onondaga, and Jefferson County, I think the opt-out numbers varied from school to school, but some were high as 20%. Most of them are probably around the 10 or 15% as opt-out.
For some parts of the state, some parts of the state, those numbers were up over half.
Yeah, that's incredible, isn't it?
Half the students, the parents had real concerns about this.
Right.
And I guess in some places they're seeing stress levels go through the roof and the kids are acting out and
Right.
it's becoming a real problem. And I think too, some parents were better informed about the opt-out option, if that's correct.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think some people didn't know there was even an opt-out option, I guess. Then some maybe thought that if they did opt out, there were some sort of penalties that were going to happen to either their kids or to the school. It's a little unclear exactly. I've heard that some funding, Title I think money from the federal government might get cut, but really from a budgetary standpoint, that's not a lot of funding relatively to all the schools. So I was of kind of two minds of it. I'm not necessarily against testing for diagnostic reasons for students. I think it can serve a valuable tool, frankly, to see where students are and make sure that they're on level with their peers in other schools and around the state. The real problem, I do happen to agree with the teachers, though, is evaluating teachers or holding penalties for people that don't do well on tests. For instance, maybe you don't do well. I don't necessarily think you should hold a student back as a result of not doing well. What we really ought to do is provide them with extra help to make sure they can catch up. And the same with the teachers. Evaluating teachers maybe eventually on state testing, once it's been implemented for many years, maybe would serve as a valuable tool, but now it just doesn't seem quite fair. You implement this system in a year or two and then expect teachers that didn't have control of any of those younger students coming up all of a sudden have their evaluations based on how those students are doing on state testing. It's just been implemented. And frankly, Mike, as you probably heard, there's been a lot of problems with this testing too. It's not like it's some great system that's just immediately got put down. So
I think that's what resonates with a lot of parents is the concept. Testing is fine. We all got tested when we were going through the grades. Testing is fine as long as it's to determine where the students are. So if they need more, if they're doing great, or maybe they need a little bit more help. But it's when there is additional testing, not for the students, but to figure out the teachers, and if they're doing their jobs right, that's where it starts to get muddy, and you really do start to wonder, how much are we going to ask of the kids?
Right, and that just puts stress on the whole system. So I can understand. I chose personally not to opt my child out just because I wanted to see where he would do, frankly, on the tests, and I understood for him it probably wouldn't be punitive, but I am sympathetic with the teachers and tying their evaluations. So I think, well, I'll be curious. SED, I guess, just announced last week that they're going to put off a year to try to come up with this formula of how they're going to use the testing on teachers' evaluations. So I guess we're not going to know now for another year. So that
better for them to sit back and figure it out than to kind of, I don't want to say shove it down the throats, but that's pretty much what's been happening.
Right. Yeah, I suppose that is a better solution. It might be even better to have the legislature decide, as long as it's an informed decision by the legislature, which, as you know, Mike, isn't always the case. So either way, I'm glad that we didn't set it in stone with a 50% in this year's budget.
That's one of the things that always intrigues me about education issues, is that there are so many layers to this onion. There is the legislature, there is the governor's office, the executive, there is the board of regents, there is the local school districts, there's what goes on in the classrooms, there's the school boards in each district, the superintendents, the administrations, the teachers, the unions. There's so much that you see where disagreements come about pretty easily.
And there's so many gray areas, aren't there? I mean, you have great teachers, you have marginal teachers. I mean, that's right. You have wealthy school districts versus low wealth school districts. Opportunity abound, parents' involvement. I mean, there's so many different ingredients that go into the success of a student learning. It makes it tough to try to implement policy from a macro sense.
How about fiscally speaking with this budget? How about the counties that you represent, how they make out in terms of economic development, bringing businesses into the region? What do you take away from this?
Well, unfortunately, Mike, as I've mentioned on this show many times, I think the economy really is the #1 issue in upstate New York, and central New York's no exception to that. We've lagged behind the national economy and actually other areas of the state for quite some time. So economic development really has to be front and center of what we do in New York State. If I had my dithers, I would say we should lower the cost of doing business across the board, because that makes everybody more competitive instead of having the government come in and pick and choose, what businesses we're going to support with subsidies from state government versus others that get left out. So I guess again of two minds on this. The governor obviously proposed a new economic development aid package for all the upstate region outside of Buffalo. That was essentially $1.5 billion to go to economic aid.
Is that the Startup New York
Well,
program?
no, it's a little different than the
It's
Startup
different.
New York. This is the so-called Hunger Games.
Oh, the big
competitive money.
competition thing.
7 regions of upstate New York will compete for three $500 million economic aid grants, essentially, and each have to come up with a plan. I guess where I think this is not a great way to provide economic development, particularly because if you're the left out region, what are you going to do? You know, it doesn't seem like that's going to solve their problems.
Right.
You got nothing.
You got nothing.
So I was skeptical about it. Continue to be skeptical. The one thing that I'm optimistic about, I feel we do have a great economic development team in central New York, which includes my area, Oswego and Onondaga County. So I feel confident that we will be able to put together a very good plan for this, and I feel confident that we can win the $500 million.
But you might have a great plan, and you might have the best people drawing up that plan. But who's judging the plan?
Right. That's a great. I mean, it ultimately comes down to the governor, isn't
right?
it?
Right. It's like the governor, and gee, I guess that kind of makes this a political process that might not be judged solely on the merits of the plans.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, and that's another reason why I'm skeptical about this whole process. You know, if we took $1.5 billion and just took it into the coffers and cut, you know, our taxes, that would be a good place to start. Regulatory reform. You know, we have some of the highest workers' comp costs in the nation. There's so much we could do without, you could subsidize on a state level those types of costs to help ease the burden on everybody, probably be much more successful in the long run. But again, we have this system in place. This is what passed in the budget, for better or worse. So we'll have to get behind our economic development people and hopefully win at least the $500 million. So at least central New York is not left behind in these so-called Hunger Games.
The governor did, though, just go to Cuba. So maybe, you know, Oswego County and Cuba could develop a...
Someone mentioned, I think there's a Cuba in western New York.
Oh, yeah, there is.
Nice he's going to Cuba, the country. I wish he'd come over to Cuba in western New York. Yeah, I think that's, you know, unfortunate from many different levels, but I'm not sure that's where our focus for economic development is going to be in the opening of Cuba. I mean, even if it was a vibrant country, economically, it's still a small country, and, you know, ultimately for New York, it's going to be a drop in the bucket as far as trying to recover economically. So, you know, the governor, I'm not going to question anyone's politics or motives of what he's doing, but I wish he would be focusing a little bit more on upstate versus taking this trip to Cuba.
I've got about a minute and a half left. There's a big problem facing upstate New York now, apparently, with synthetic drugs. What are you hearing? Is this a problem for the areas, the counties that you represent?
I'm glad you raised it, Mike. It is a huge problem. It's been a problem now for a number of years. It seemed to subside a little bit, and now we're seeing a real big new influx, particularly in the Syracuse area. And I have legislation. It's going to be one of my priorities for the rest of the session, is try to get some legislation that will help get synthetic drugs off the street. The problem with synthetics is, as we outlaw drugs now on the controlled substance list by a formula, you know, based on whatever the drug's compound is. Synthetic drugs, because they're synthetic, they can just change that formula just a little bit. So all of a sudden, these drugs that had been illegal, all of a sudden, there's no enforcement by government to be able to prosecute people either possessing or selling this drug. We thought they had it on the labeling. The governor, to his credit, a number of years ago, put a health department regulation out that allowed them to crack down. Even though it was only a violation, it was able to crack down, particularly on these head shops that were selling it. But for whatever reason, it's now made a reappearance. They think it's coming out of New York and being shipped up to Syracuse. It is very, very dangerous. We have the heroin problem epidemic that we have. Well, the synthetic drugs is also another one that we have to concentrate. And we desperately need legislation in here to help fight this terrible scourge.
All right, well, we'll be talking with you in future programs, though, seeing how that is coming along. And we want to thank Will Barclay for joining us for our program today. And thank you folks, too, for spending your time with us as well. We'll hope to see you all soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.